Welcome to Nightverse lore! Oh geez, another dimension of naps!
Hey there, sleepyheads, glad to have you back. Before we slip into tonight's tale, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. That luminous rain I spoke of, the kind that carries memory in each drop, had been falling on Seren for 3 days when Naya first felt the pull in her bones. She had lived through enough seasons to recognize when the planet was preparing to share something important, the way you might sense a friend gathering courage to tell you a secret they've held too long. The blood rain, as the old ones called it, didn't come often, perhaps once in a generation, but when it did, it always brought change wrapped in gentleness. From her cottage window, Naya watched the crimson drops catch starlight as they fell, each one glowing with its own soft pulse. They pooled in her garden without disturbing the herbs, collected in her rain barrels without staining the wood. This wasn't the kind of rain that demanded shelter. It was the kind that invited you to step outside and remember what wonder felt like. Her dried lavender bundles swayed as if touched by invisible hands, and the jars of healing tinctures hummed with a frequency she could feel more than hear. The third night, as the aurora above wove itself into patterns that looked almost like lullabies made visible, something deeper called to her. Not urgency. Naya had learned long ago that the most important things never hurried, but a quiet knowing that settled in her chest like a warm stone. She wrapped her grandmother's shawl around her shoulders, the one that still held the scent of chamomile and patient love, and stepped into the glowing dusk. The path to the grove revealed itself in silver puddles that reflected not the sky above but something deeper, the planet's own quiet dreaming, perhaps. Her bare feet found their way by instinct, past the leaning juniper that always whispered secrets to the wind, past the old birch with bark like paper prayers. The blood rain fell more gently here, as if it knew this was sacred ground, each drop finding its place with the reverence of a blessing being offered. At the heart of the grove, where the oldest trees formed a natural circle, the luminous rain had gathered into a perfect pool. The water, if you could call it water, held light the way a cupped palm holds morning dew, precious and temporary and somehow eternal all at once. And there, cradled in the soft moss at the pool's edge, was what the planet had been preparing to give. A baby no larger than a loaf fresh from the oven lay sleeping with the kind of peace that only comes to those who have never known fear. Her skin seemed to drink the falling light, each luminous drop absorbed as naturally as earth absorbs rain. When she breathed, tiny sparkles of silver moved beneath her translucent skin, as if she carried her own constellation just beneath the surface. Naya knelt beside the child, her old joints accepting the familiar ache without complaint. She had delivered dozens of babies in her years as the settlement's herbalist, but this was different. This wasn't birth. This was arrival, as if the planet itself had dreamed a child into being and then gently set her down where she would be found by exactly the right hands. The moment Naya lifted her, the baby opened eyes that held the same silver luminescence as the pooled rain. Not the searching gaze of most newborns, but something deeper, recognition perhaps, or simply the quiet confidence of someone who knows they are exactly where they belong. She made no sound, content to rest against the steady rhythm of Naya's heartbeat, while the blood rain continued its gentle benediction around them. Walking back toward the cottage, Naya found herself humming an old tune her own grandmother had sung, 4 notes that always seemed to know the way home. The baby settled deeper into her arms, and as they moved through the grove, Naya felt something shift in the air around them. The accumulated weight of old sorrows seemed to lift from the trees, from the earth, from her own tired shoulders, as if the child's presence was already beginning to teach the world how to let go of what it no longer needed to carry. Zara, she whispered to the night air, the name arriving on her lips like a gift. It meant blooming in the old tongue, but also the gentle fire that burns without consuming, perfect for a child born from light itself. The baby's breathing deepened into the rhythm Naya recognized as the planet's own pulse, steady, patient, trusting that each moment would unfold exactly as it should. By the time they reached the cottage, the blood rain had begun to slow, its work complete. Naya settled into her rocking chair, the one that had held 3 generations of women learning the art of listening to what the world needed. As she held this luminous child against her chest, feeling the soft flutter of a heartbeat that seemed to echo the planet's own gentle breathing. She understood that her story was beginning a new chapter, one that would teach her things about love and letting go that she had never imagined possible. Outside, the last drops of light rain whispered against the windows like a lullaby finding its way to rest, and somewhere in that gentle sound, the future began to unfurl itself with all the patience of a flower learning to trust the dawn. Morning arrived like a gentle exhale, and the cottage seemed to stretch itself awake around them. The last traces of luminous rain clung to the window panes like sleepy dewdrops, each one holding a whisper of the night's magic before finally letting go and sliding toward the earth. Zara, nestled in the crook of Naya's arm, breathed with the steady rhythm of someone who had never known a restless night, her silver-touched skin catching the early light like water reflecting stars. The days that followed arranged themselves into patterns as natural as breathing. Naya moved through her morning rituals with the same gentle deliberation she had practiced for decades, but now each action carried the warm weight of shared purpose. The kettle sang its familiar song, the dried herbs released their patient fragrances, and Zara watched it all with eyes that seemed to drink in not just the sights, but the feelings that lived beneath them. By her third year, it became clear that the blood rain had left more than silver traces beneath her skin. Zara would pause in doorways, her small hand pressed against wooden frames, and whisper observations that made Naya's heart skip with recognition. The sadness is ready to go now, she might say, or this room wants to breathe deeper. At first, Naya wondered if this was simply the beautiful imagination that all children possess. But then she began to notice what happened in the spaces after Zara's gentle pronouncements. The guest room, which had held the lingering grief of a woman who had stayed there years earlier while mourning her husband, suddenly filled with the scent of jasmine one morning after Zara had spent time sitting quietly on its threshold. The kitchen corner where Naya's own mother had wept during her final illness began to catch sunlight differently, as if invisible cobwebs had been cleared away with the most tender of hands. "She can sense when things are ready to let go," Naya murmured to herself one evening, watching Zara help prepare their simple meal of root stew and warm bread. The child moved with an unhurried grace that seemed to calm even the steam rising from their bowls, and Naya understood that this wasn't about taking on the weight of old sorrows, but about offering them permission to transform. Their daily rhythms became a meditation in themselves. Mornings were for tending the herb garden, where Zara's small fingers somehow knew which plants needed water and which preferred to be left alone. She would hum while she worked, not melodies Naya had taught her, but tunes that seemed to rise from serene soil itself, four-note phrases that made the dream root grow more fragrant and encouraged the healing mint to spread in perfect spirals. One afternoon, when the crimson light of Serene's long sunset painted their cottage walls the color of gentle fire, a neighbor named Kess arrived carrying a wooden box that seemed too heavy for its size. His grandmother's letters, he explained, written during the plague years when hope felt as distant as the furthest moon. He couldn't bring himself to read them, but couldn't bear to burn them either. Zara looked up from where she sat braiding dried lavender, her luminous eyes reflecting the evening light. She tilted her head in that particular way she had, as if listening to music only she could hear. "They're ready to become something else," she said simply, setting down her braid and approaching the box with the reverence of someone approaching a sleeping bird. She didn't touch the letters themselves, but placed her small hands on either side of the wooden box and began to hum, that same four-note melody that seemed to know the way home. The air around them grew warmer, not with heat but with presence, and Naya felt something shift in the space between heartbeats. The letters, still unread, seemed to exhale decades of held breath, releasing not their words but their weight, transforming from burden into blessing. Kess opened the box with trembling hands and found that he could finally see past the sorrow to the love that had written each careful line. The letters remained, but they had become something gentler, not monuments to loss but bridges to understanding. He wept then, but they were tears that felt like rain after drought, washing clean rather than drowning. As evening deepened into the soft embrace of night, Naya and Zara settled into their cherished ritual. Wrapped in a single thick blanket on the cottage porch, they watched the sun's final farewell paint the sky in shades of rose and amber. "See how the day doesn't fight the night?" Naya whispered, her voice carrying the weight of generations of wisdom. It simply exhales, making space for the stars to remember their own light. Zara leaned into Naya's warmth and tried to feel the planet's great exhale, imagining it as a gentle sigh that released the day's small burdens into the vast, understanding darkness. And as she did, she heard something else, a faint chiming carried on the evening breeze like wind bells made of crystallized laughter. She turned her head toward the sound, catching a glimpse of movement in the settlement below, but the moment folded itself back into the gentle bustle of evening, leaving only a pleasant curiosity and the ghost of a melody. That night, as Zara drifted toward dreams in her alcove near the kitchen hearth, the cottage settled around them, with a contentment that seemed to pulse with the planet's own gentle heartbeat. Outside, new flowers were beginning to bloom in the grove, where the blood rain had pooled. Varieties unseen on Seren for generations, their petals holding traces of the same luminescence that lived beneath her skin, as if the world itself was learning to let go of old patterns and make space for something beautiful and unprecedented to grow. The chiming sound that had drifted to them on the evening breeze returned 3 days later, clearer now, like a memory finally deciding it was ready to be remembered. Zara and Naya were hanging bundles of sleep mint to dry when the crystalline notes found them again, floating through the cottage windows with the patience of something that had been waiting for exactly the right moment to reveal itself. Following the sound led them down the gentle slope toward the settlement's quieter edges, where the morning light filtered through leaves that seemed to whisper secrets to anyone willing to listen. There, beneath an old birch whose silver bark caught the sun like captured moonbeams, sat a boy perhaps a year older than Zara. His dark hair fell across thoughtful eyes, and in his hands he held what looked like a collection of small glass bottles, each one containing something that wasn't quite visible but somehow felt important. When he moved, the bottles created that same ethereal music Zara had heard on the wind, not the random clatter of empty vessels, but something intentional, like a lullaby being born one note at a time. He looked up as their shadows fell across his workspace, and his face brightened with the relief of someone who had been hoping for exactly this encounter. "I'm Fen," he said, his voice carrying the careful gentleness of someone who had learned that first words mattered more than most people realized. "My grandmother said I might find you here. She said there was a girl who helps things remember how to let go." He lifted one of the smaller bottles, holding it up to catch the filtered sunlight. "I collect sighs," he explained simply. "The kind people make when they're almost ready to release something, but haven't quite figured out how yet." Zara approached with the unhurried curiosity that had become her way of meeting the world's mysteries. She could feel something familiar radiating from those bottles, the same quality of readiness she sensed in rooms that wanted to breathe deeper, in hearts that had carried their burdens long enough. "What happens to them?" she asked, settling beside him on the soft grass. Fen's eyes lit with understanding. "That's what I've been wondering. I can catch them, but they always feel unfinished, like they're waiting for permission to complete their journey." He uncorked one of the bottles with reverent care, and immediately the air around them filled with something that wasn't quite sound, but wasn't quite silence either, the ghost of an exhale that had never quite found its voice. Without thinking, Zara placed her hands around the bottle, not touching it but creating a space of gentle presence around it. She began to hum her 4-note melody, the one that always seemed to know the way home. As her voice settled into the air between them, something beautiful happened. The captured sigh seemed to expand, growing from a whisper of held breath into something larger, something that could finally complete its transformation from holding on to letting go. When the sound faded, both children sat in wonder. The bottle was empty now, but not because its contents had disappeared, because what it held had finally found the courage to rejoin the larger conversation between earth and sky, between keeping and releasing. "It's not trapped anymore," Fen whispered, his voice filled with awe. "It's free." Their friendship grew in that moment of shared understanding, the way moss grows on stone, slowly, quietly, but with surprising strength. Over the following days, they developed a rhythm as natural as breathing. Fen would bring his collected, almost exhales, and Zara would help them remember how to finish what they had started. They discovered that her presence created a safe space for these half-formed releases to find their voice, while his gentle reverence gave them a moment of acknowledged beauty before they dissolved into transformation. One afternoon, they visited old Henrik, the settlement's candle maker, whose workshop had grown heavy with years of accumulated worry about his failing eyesight. Zara felt the familiar tug of readiness in the air around his workbench, while Fen heard the almost sigh that caught in the old man's throat each time he squinted at his work. Together, they created a space where Henrik could finally exhale the fear he'd been carrying, letting it transform into acceptance, then into a kind of peace that made his remaining vision feel like a gift rather than a loss. As evening approached and they walked back toward Naya's cottage, Fen pulled out a bottle unlike any of the others. It was larger, made of glass so clear it seemed to hold light itself, and when he moved it, the sound was different, deeper, more complex, like a chord instead of a single note. "I've been saving this one," he said, his voice carrying the weight of something important. It came from the planet itself during the last blood rain. "I think Seren has been holding its breath for a very long time, and it's finally ready to exhale." Zara felt something shift in the air around them, not urgency, but anticipation, like the moment just before the first spring rain after a patient winter. Whatever they had been learning together was preparing to serve something larger than they had yet imagined, and the thought filled her with a quiet excitement that tasted like honey and starlight. The evening settled around them like a gentle embrace, and somewhere in the distance, the planet seemed to sigh in its sleep, dreaming of all the beautiful transformations yet to come. The bottle containing the planet's held breath seemed to pulse with gentle anticipation through the following days, its clear glass catching morning light like captured starlight waiting for the right moment to rejoin the sky. Zara found herself drawn to sit beside it each evening, feeling the way its presence made the air around them hum with quiet readiness, as if something ancient and patient was finally preparing to speak. On the fourth morning, as they shared their simple breakfast of warm bread and herb tea, Naya set down her cup with the deliberate care that always preceded important words. "There's someone you should meet," she said, her eyes holding the soft gleam of recognition that came when pieces of a larger pattern began to reveal themselves. "She knows the old ways of helping the world release what it no longer needs to carry." The path to Kestrel's cottage wound upward, through groves where silver-barked trees whispered secrets to the morning breeze, past meadows where dream grass swayed like gentle thoughts finding their rhythm. As they climbed, Zara noticed how the landscape itself seemed to breathe more deeply here, as if the earth remembered something peaceful about letting go. Kestrel's home emerged from the hillside like a natural flowering of stone and timber, its walls embracing the slope with the patient grace of something that had grown rather than been built. Vines traced delicate patterns across windows that welcomed light without demanding it, and from within came a sound like rain thinking about falling, the steady whisper of a loom at work. The woman who greeted them moved with the unhurried elegance of someone who had learned to measure time in seasons rather than moments. Her silver hair caught the filtered sunlight like spun moonbeams, and her hands, marked by years of gentle labor, held the kind of strength that came from creating rather than grasping. When she looked at Zara, her eyes reflected depths that seemed to hold not just years but cycles, the patient turning of worlds through their endless dance of holding and releasing. "The weaving season stirs," Kestrel said simply, settling them around a low table where skeins of yarn hung like captured rainbows. Her fingers never stopped their rhythmic dance with the threads, each movement carrying the weight of ritual made sacred through repetition. "I felt the planet's readiness in my bones 3 nights ago. The old patterns are loosening, preparing to transform." She gestured toward the bottle that Fen carried with such reverence, and nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose patient waiting had been rewarded. "Every 7 years," she continued, her voice carrying the cadence of ancient wisdom, "Seren teaches us how to release what has grown too heavy for comfortable carrying, not through violence or force, but the way trees let go of their leaves in autumn, natural, necessary, and beautiful in its own quiet way." Zara listened with her whole being, feeling the familiar tug of recognition that came when something true aligned with something she had always known, but never named. Kestrel explained how communities would gather during these seasons, bringing their accumulated sorrows, their inherited fears, their patterns that had hardened into habit rather than choice. "The planet holds our burdens for us," Kestrel said, lifting a length of fabric that seemed to shift between silver and deep blue, like water reflecting starlight. Every tear shed in anger, every worry carried too long, every grief that has forgotten how to flow. Serene absorbs these things with the patience of a mother holding a crying child. But even planets need to exhale, need to transform what they've held into nourishment for new growth. She placed the luminous cloth in Zara's hands, and immediately the air around them filled with a sense of safety, so profound it made Zara's chest loosen with unexpected relief. "This is woven from intention," Kestrel explained, watching how the girl's fingers instinctively understood the fabric's gentle weight. Each thread carries the wish for transformation without violence, for the kind of letting go that makes space for joy, rather than simply creating emptiness. Over the afternoon, Kestrel guided their hands in the sacred craft. Zara's small fingers learned to work with threads that hummed with their own quiet music, while Fen discovered how his collected sighs could be woven directly into the fabric's rhythm. They created what Kestrel called listening cloths, coverings that didn't take burdens but witnessed them, held space for them to remember their own readiness to transform. "The cloth becomes a threshold," Kestrel explained, as Zara's four-note melody seemed to weave itself into the very fibers. When someone wraps themselves in it, they feel held safely enough to let their pain remember how to become wisdom, their fear remember how to become understanding. As evening approached and the cottage filled with the golden light of Seren's long sunset, the bottle on their table began to glow with soft inner radiance. The planetary sigh it contained seemed ready now, after days of patient preparation, to rejoin the larger conversation between earth and sky. Zara approached it with the reverence she had learned from watching Naya tend her most precious herbs. When she placed her hands around the clear glass and began her gentle humming, the bottle seemed to dissolve without breaking, and what emerged wasn't sound but feeling. The deep exhale of a world ready to compost accumulated sorrow into fertile soil for dreams yet to be born. The cottage filled with warmth that tasted like forgiveness and felt like coming home after a long journey through difficult weather. Outside, the first drops of new blood rain began to fall, each luminous drop carrying the promise that the great season of gentle release was beginning, and with it, the patient revolution that would teach an entire world how to let go with love. Kestrel smiled as she folded the newly woven listening cloths with ceremonial care. "The gathering will be stronger this time," she said softly. Serene itself is asking. We prepare gently, teaching hands how to weave doors for the heart, teaching hearts how to trust them. As they walked home through the silver-touched evening, Zara carried the cloths like folded starlight, feeling their gentle weight as both gift and responsibility. The approaching season hummed in the air around them, patient as breathing, inevitable as dawn, and somewhere in the grove where she had first been found, new flowers were beginning to bloom, varieties unseen on Seren for generations, their petals holding traces of the same luminescence that lived beneath her skin, as if the world itself was learning to let go of old patterns and make space for something beautiful and unprecedented to grow. The morning after their work with Kestrel brought visitors to the settlement's edge, not the hurried kind who arrived with demands, but the gentle sort who approached like morning mist, present without intrusion. A small caravan had arranged itself in the meadow beyond Naya's herb garden, their canvas-covered wagons forming a circle that welcomed rather than excluded, with cook fires sending up ribbons of smoke scented with healing herbs and patient hope. Zara watched from the kitchen window as figures moved among the wagons with the unhurried grace of people who had learned to measure their days in moments of connection, rather than distances covered. There was something familiar in their movements, the same quality of presence she had felt around Kestrel, the sense of people who carried wisdom lightly, like water cupped in gentle hands. "The traveling season has begun," Naya said, setting her teacup down with the soft satisfaction of someone whose patient waiting had been rewarded. "They come every 7 years, when the planet's readiness calls to those who have learned to listen." A woman approached their door with steps that seemed to find harmony with the Earth's own rhythm. Her hair was braided with small bells that chimed like distant laughter, and her eyes held the depth of someone who had seen enough sorrow to recognize joy as precious rather than frivolous. "I am Mira," she said, inclining her head with the respect of one wanderer greeting another. "We felt the planet stirring from 3 settlements away. There's a child who helps things remember how to let go, yes? The caravan revealed itself as a marvel of thoughtful preparation. Each wagon held not just practical supplies, healing herbs, warm blankets, sturdy tools, but also the materials for creating safety. Soft fabrics like those Kestrel had taught them to weave, instruments that could coax music from the simplest materials, and the accumulated wisdom of people who understood that transformation required patience above all else. Fen appeared at Zara's elbow as if summoned by the moment's importance, his collection of bottles chiming softly in the morning breeze. The travelers gathered around him with the delight of people recognizing a kindred spirit. And soon the air filled with the most beautiful conversation, not words exactly, but the exchange of understanding between people who had all learned to hear what the world was trying to release. When Mira asked if they would like to join the caravan for the traveling season, the question felt less like an invitation than like the natural next step in a dance they had been learning all their lives. Naya packed them sandwiches wrapped in cloth, fresh bread with herbed cheese and slices of orchard fruit, then held Zara's face in both hands. "Go gently," she murmured. "Remember that you are not a river carrying everything away. You are the bank, giving shape to the water." Their first days with the caravan taught Zara the delicate difference between eagerness and patience. At a riverside settlement, she encountered a baker whose guilt over the previous season's failed harvest had hardened in her chest like overbaked crust. Zara approached with youthful earnestness, wanting immediately to help the woman find release. She wrapped a listening cloth around the baker's shoulders, began her four-note melody, but the woman remained rigid, her sorrow locked tight. Later, an elderly man named Tobias, who crafted instruments from materials communities had lovingly surrendered, sat beside Zara as evening settled around their wagons. "The garden cannot be forced to bloom before its time," he said gently, his weathered hands working old letters into a drum that would someday beat with the rhythm of resolved sorrow. "You can prepare the soil, offer water and light, but the flower must choose its own moment to open." The wisdom settled in Zara's heart like gentle rain. She understood then that her role was less about actively purging and more about creating perfect conditions for release. The next day she returned to the baker, not with solutions but with presence, sitting quietly while the woman kneaded her daily bread. When the release finally came, a long exhale that tasted of forgiveness, the bread that emerged from the ovens carried the warmth of patience, instead of the bitterness of, self-blame. As they traveled from settlement to settlement, the caravan became Zara's first true taste of chosen family. There was Ilara, whose songs were like warm blankets for weary souls, and River, who could read the emotional weather patterns of entire communities like others might read approaching storms. Each evening, they shared simple meals around crackling fires, exchanging stories that carried the quiet power of snowflakes that, accumulating gently, could transform entire landscapes. Fen discovered his own evolution within this traveling family, learning to craft delicate wind chimes from materials people had released. When someone finally let go of long-held grief, he would hang a chime nearby, its gentle music, a soft echo of their newfound freedom, a reminder that what was released was not lost, but transformed into something beautiful. One evening, as they prepared to enter a valley where the roofs caught, light but reflected little back, a place where tears had grown rare as thunderbirds and grief had learned to hide in useful habits, Mira placed a gentle hand on Zara's shoulder. "Tomorrow we help a community remember how to weep," she said softly. "They've held their sorrow so long it's crystallized into silence." Zara nodded, feeling the familiar flutter of anticipation mixed with reverence that came before important work. Around them, the caravan settled into rest like a family that had been chosen rather than inherited, each person valued for their unique way of creating space for transformation. Somewhere in the darkness, Seren itself seemed to exhale with satisfaction, its blood rain beginning to fall in gentle drops that caught the dying firelight like liquid stars, each one carrying the promise of patient revolution made manifest through love. The valley revealed itself at dawn like a held breath that had forgotten how to exhale, its houses arranged with the careful precision of people who had learned that feeling too much led to breaking. And breaking was something their community could no longer afford. As the caravan descended the winding path, Zara felt the familiar tug of recognition. but wrapped in something more complex than simple readiness. This was grief that had crystallized over years into something harder than stone, more fragile than glass. The settlement's elder, a woman named Thessa, whose spine held itself straight as a measuring rod, greeted them with courtesy that kept everyone at careful distance. Her silver hair was braided so tightly it seemed to pull at the corners of her eyes, and when she spoke, her words carried the weight of protocols learned during harder times. "We manage our affairs quite efficiently here," she said, gesturing towards streets where even the children played in whispers, their games stripped of laughter like fruit picked too early. Walking through the village square, Zara noticed how the very air seemed thickened with accumulated silence. Fen moved beside her, his bottles chiming softly, but even their gentle music felt muffled, absorbed by an atmosphere that had forgotten how to let sound travel freely. "There are no sighs here," he whispered, his voice instinctively hushed. It's as if the breath itself has learned to stop halfway. Their first attempts to create space for release met with polite bewilderment. The listening cloths were accepted with careful nods, but folded neatly away, their comforting presence unable to penetrate layers of protection built up over seasons of necessary numbness. When Zara tried her four-note melody, it seemed to dissipate into the quiet air without finding purchase, like seeds scattered on ground too frozen to receive them. That evening, as the caravan settled around their small fire, Mira placed a gentle hand on Zara's shoulder. "Some gardens require a longer winter before they're ready for spring," she said softly. "Tomorrow we try something different." The breakthrough came not through technique but through memory. Sitting in the square the next morning, watching Thessa move through her daily routines with mechanical precision, Zara found herself thinking of Naya, not her teachings about release and transformation, but something simpler. The lullaby Naya had sung on countless nights, 4 notes that spoke not of letting go, but of being held so safely that vulnerability became possible. Without planning, Zara began to hum that ancient melody, the one that had carried her to sleep through childhood storms and growing pains. She sang it not to the villagers, but to the air itself, offering it like a warm cloth against cold skin. The tune spoke of unconditional acceptance, of the quiet bravery it took to simply exist, of harbors safe enough for the most fragile cargo. At first, nothing changed. Thessa continued her careful movements. Other villagers maintained their respectful distances. But Zara kept singing, her voice a steady current in the silent air, and gradually she noticed something shift in the quality of attention around her. People weren't watching her exactly, but they weren't not watching either, as if the melody was reaching places in them that had been carefully locked away. The first crack appeared in an old man named Corwin, who had been sitting on a bench with the stillness of carved stone. His weathered hands, folded precisely in his lap, began to tremble, just slightly, like leaves sensing the first breath of wind after a long calm. When the first tear gathered at the corner of his eye, it clung there for what felt like an eternity, as if it had forgotten the way down. When it finally fell, the droplet seemed to carry with it years of accumulated silence. Corwin's shoulders shook once, then settled, and something in his face softened like ice beginning to remember it could flow. The sight seemed to unlock something in the others, not a sudden flood, but a gentle, incremental thawing that spread through the square like warmth from a carefully tended fire. Thessa approached slowly, her rigid posture wavering for the first time since their arrival. "We stopped," she whispered, her voice carrying decades of careful control. "After the fever took so many children, we decided tears were unproductive, that they made the remaining ones afraid." She watched Corwin cradle his own grief with newfound tenderness. "But he looks lighter somehow." Zara nodded, understanding flowing through her like honey dissolved in warm water. "Tears aren't about making things better," she said softly. "They're about making things true. And truth has its own kind of healing." As the blood rain began to fall more steadily, each luminous drop catching the light of the village's carefully maintained lanterns, the square filled with something unprecedented, the sound of a community remembering how to breathe fully. Children's laughter emerged tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. The rigid geometry of the settlement seemed to soften, as if the very buildings were learning to exhale. When evening came, Fen had gathered enough genuine sighs to fill his largest bottle, not the simple exhales of individual release, but complex harmonies that spoke of an entire community learning to trust their own hearts again. The village that had forgotten how to cry was slowly, gently, remembering that feeling deeply wasn't a luxury they couldn't afford, but a necessity they couldn't afford to abandon. As the caravan prepared for rest, Zara carried with her the profound understanding that sometimes the most important healing happened not through dramatic transformation, but through the simple act of helping people remember permissions they had given themselves long ago, then forgotten they possessed. Outside their wagons, the settlement settled into sleep with a new kind of quiet. Not the silence of suppression, but the peaceful breathing of a community that had rediscovered its own heart. The memory of Thessa's loosened hair and the sound of an entire village, remembering how to breathe, followed them like a gentle blessing as the caravan wound its way through Siren's patient landscapes. In Zara's palm, the ribbon Thessa had pressed there before their departure felt warm with possibility, not the tight binding it had once been, but something that could hold without constraining, embrace without suffocating. Walking beside the wagons as morning light filtered through leaves that whispered secrets to the breeze, Fen carried his collection of bottles with new reverence. The harmonized sighs from the valley sang softly with each step, their crystalline notes weaving together, like voices in a choir that had finally learned to trust its own music. "They're different when they're together," he said, more to the bottles than to Zara, his voice carrying the wonder of someone discovering a new language. One person's exhale is a single note, but when a whole community lets go at once, it becomes something larger, a chord that holds all their individual songs. His words settled in the air between them with the weight of recognition, and Zara felt something shift in her understanding of their shared work. She had always focused on creating space for individual release, but watching an entire village remember how to cry had shown her something deeper about the way healing could ripple through communities like gentle waves expanding across still water. At their next camp, beneath a willow that leaned over a stream as if listening to its secrets, Fern spread his tools on a small work table that Tobias had helped him craft from driftwood and intention. The materials people had released during their journey lay arranged like precious offerings, broken jewelry that had once encircled grief, letters whose words had grown too heavy to carry, small treasures that held more memory than their modest substance suggested. Zara settled beside him, her four-note melody humming softly as she watched his hands work with the patient reverence of someone coaxing music from silence. He took the fragments of a silver bracelet, its charms tarnished with years of accumulated sorrow, and began to reshape them into something new. Not erasing their history, but helping them remember a different song, one that spoke of transformation rather than loss. "What once held pain can ring with freedom," he murmured, his fingers threading the reclaimed silver through lengths of gut string with the careful attention of someone weaving prayers. When the first breeze found his newly created wind chime, it answered with music that seemed to carry both memory and release, each note a testament to the beautiful alchemy of letting go. The sound drew others from the caravan, Mira pausing in her evening preparations, River looking up from their study of the emotional currents that flowed through the landscape like invisible rivers. One woman touched the chime gently and whispered, "It sounds like my grandmother's kitchen when the bread was ready." Another laughed softly, surprised to discover that joy and sorrow could occupy the same space without diminishing each other. As twilight deepened and the familiar aurora began its nightly dance across Siren's sky, Zara found herself watching Fen with new eyes. There was something in the gentle concentration of his work, the way he listened to materials as if they were confiding their deepest wishes, that made her chest feel warm and loose, like honey dissolved in tea. She had always known he was special, but now she saw how his gift complemented hers, where she created space for release. He caught the echoes of transformation and gave them lasting form. "I've been thinking about permanence," he said softly, not looking up from the delicate instrument taking shape in his hands. "How everything we help people release becomes something new. Your voice helps their pain remember how to flow, and I try to capture some essence of that transformation, give it a form that can keep singing long after the moment has passed." Their conversation was interrupted by River's quiet voice from across the fire. "Pressure building," they said, their eyes half closed as they read currents invisible to others. "Not alarm, invitation." The great convergence is approaching. Mira nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose patient waiting was about to be rewarded. We'll turn toward Crossfield tomorrow, she decided, where the 5 paths meet and the ground remembers everyone's footsteps. That night, as they prepared for rest, Fen tied Thessa's ribbon to his satchel strap, not with a tight knot that would bind, but with a soft loop that could be undone without struggle. The gesture held more meaning than words could carry, a promise that love, like everything else in their world, was something to be held gently, allowed to grow at its own pace. Lying in their bedrolls with canvas walls between them and the star-drunk sky, Zara felt the approaching season humming in the air like a song on the edge of being born. Somewhere ahead, Crossfield waited with its patient heart, ready to hold whatever the planet was preparing to release. And beside her, separated by mere fabric but connected by something deeper than proximity, Fen breathed with the steady rhythm of someone who had found his place in the world's gentle revolution. The blood rain began to fall more steadily now, each luminous drop carrying the promise that the great season of letting go was drawing near. And 2 hearts that had learned to love each other were ready to help an entire world remember how to exhale with grace. Crossfield revealed itself at dawn like a prayer made manifest in stone and earth, its ancient meadow marked by 5 converging paths that had carried countless footsteps toward this sacred center, where Seren's heart beat closest to the surface. As their caravan crested the final hill, Zara felt her breath catch at the sight spread below. Not one gathering, but dozens of traveling groups arranged in gentle spirals that mirrored the Aurora's nightly dance. Their wagons and tents creating a temporary city, built from intention rather than permanence. The blood rain had been falling steadily for 3 days now, each luminous drop adding to pools that reflected not just light, but accumulated readiness, creating mirrors that showed what could be released rather than what was held. The very air hummed with the patient gathering of communities who had felt Seren's great exhale approaching and answered its call with their own willingness to let go, carrying bundles wrapped in faded ribbons and memories too heavy for their modest substance. Mira guided their wagons to a place in the spiral where morning light caught the listening cloths hanging from their sides like prayer flags woven from starlight and intention. As they settled into the gathering's rhythm, Zara watched families unpacking not just practical necessities, but the careful treasures they were ready to transform. Letters whose words had grown too heavy to carry, photographs whose subjects had been grieved long enough to become blessings, small objects that held more memory than their size suggested. At the meadow's heart, where the 5 paths met around an ancient well that had drawn water and wishes from Seren's depths for generations, elders from each region worked with quiet reverence to prepare the great circle. Kestrel was among them, her silver hair catching filtered light as she spread listening cloths in overlapping patterns, creating a foundation soft enough to witness whatever needed release without judgment or haste. Fen moved through the arriving groups with bottles chiming like distant laughter, encountering sighs and almost exhales from every corner of their world. A grandmother from the eastern settlements had brought her late husband's tools, their wooden handles worn smooth by decades of gentle labor, but too heavy now, with memory to remain useful. Children carried drawings of pets who had returned to Seren's embrace, their crayon marks bright with love, ready to transform from holding on to letting go. As evening approached and the aurora began its nightly weaving across the star-drunk sky, River stood at the gathering's edge with eyes half closed, reading currents invisible to others. "First swell building," they murmured, and the assembled chimes answered as if understanding. The blood rain thickened, each drop landing like a soft knock on doors that had been closed too long. When the great releasing began, it moved through the circle like gentle weather. Zara found herself at its center, her 4-note melody rising not as performance but as permission, creating space where pain could remember how to compost itself into wisdom, the way autumn leaves become soil for spring growth. She wrapped an elderly man in a listening cloth as he spoke of his son's war letters, helping him release not the memory but its weight, transforming burden into blessing. One by one, others followed. A mother brought her daughter's outgrown clothes, ready to remember the child who had worn them with joy, rather than mourn watching her grow too quickly. A craftsman carried his father's tools, their metal surfaces reflecting aurora light, as he learned to honor inheritance without being imprisoned by it. Through it all, Fenn's instruments caught echoes of each release, transforming them into music that spoke of completion rather than ending. "Another swell," River whispered as the night deepened, and Zara felt the collective readiness building like a tide-gathering strength. This was different from individual releases. This was Seren itself, preparing to exhale through the hearts of those who called it home, a planetary breath that had been building through 7 years of patient accumulation. When the deepest wave came, Zara stepped fully into the circle's heart and let her melody rise with the truth it had always carried. Fenn uncorked his largest bottle, the one filled with the valley's harmonized sighs, and their combined music became something larger than sound. What moved through Crossfield then was memory composting into wisdom, love choosing form over fear, the planet exhaling spans of held breath so gently that no one mistook release for collapse. As the wave passed, a profound hush settled over the gathering, deep and kind. People looked at one another as if seeing a familiar room after rearranging furniture, not new but newly true. The blood rain brightened, then softened, as if the sky itself had smiled and relaxed its shoulders. Walking back toward their wagons through the peaceful aftermath, Zara felt something she hadn't noticed before, a tender heaviness beneath her ribs, like soreness after good work. Not harm, just the reminder that even rivers need banks strong enough to hold them. She settled beside Fenn as he tied Thessa's ribbon to a new chime, crafted from a farmer's released clasp, its note singing gratitude to the star-touched evening. Around the field, pools of luminous rain reflected the first stars, and in their mirrored depths, small shoots appeared, pale green and almost shy, as if surprised to find their moment had come. "Every letting go feeds something," Kestrel murmured to the night, and somewhere in the patient darkness, Serene itself seemed to sigh with satisfaction, feeling the gentle revolution of hearts learning to hold their treasures lightly, love without clinging, and trust that what was meant to stay would remain while what was ready to go would transform into something even more beautiful than memory. The tender heaviness beneath Zara's ribs that had begun at Crossfield grew more pronounced in the days that followed, like a stone that had absorbed too much water and forgotten how to float. As their caravan wound through valleys where impossible flowers bloomed in the wake of the blood rain, varieties that had never existed before this season of release, she found herself moving with careful deliberation, as if sudden movements might disturb something fragile that had taken residence in her chest. At first, she told herself it was simply the natural aftermath of such profound work. The great releasing had been unlike anything she had experienced, hundreds of hearts learning to let go simultaneously, their collective exhale moving through her like a river through too narrow a channel. But as they visited settlement after settlement, each act of witnessing seemed to add another layer to the accumulating weight, like sediment settling in a pool that had forgotten how to flow. Fenn noticed the change before she spoke it aloud, the way people who love each other learn to read the subtle shifts in familiar rhythms. "Your melody sounds different," he said one evening, as they walked beside a stream that caught aurora light like liquid starlight. His bottles chimed softly with each step, but even their crystalline music couldn't lift the heaviness that seemed to have taken residence in her bones. Not tired exactly, but muffled, like it's traveling through something thick. She tried to dismiss his concern with gentle reassurance, but the words felt hollow as empty vessels, carrying no truth that could satisfy either of them. When she wrapped people in listening cloths now, their released pain seemed to settle in her, rather than flowing through her, accumulating like leaves in a still pond. The wooden horse worn smooth by 20 years of a grandmother's grief, the letters whose words had grown too heavy to carry, the small treasures that held more memory than their substance, suggested. Each item's story seemed to echo in her chest long after its owner had found peace. The breaking point came in a settlement, where morning light caught on windows but reflected little warmth back to the world. An elderly woman named Vera approached with hands that trembled like autumn leaves, carrying her grandson's toy soldier, a small figure carved from heartwood, polished by 2 decades of grief-touched fingers. When Zara wrapped her in the softest listening cloth and began her 4-note melody, something inside her chest cracked like ice under too much pressure. Instead of creating space for Vera's pain to transform, Zara felt it pour into her own heart like water into a vessel already too full. The toy soldier seemed to pulse with accumulated sorrow. Not just Vera's grief, but every parent's loss, every grandparent's helpless love, every small treasure that had outlived the hands that once held it dear. When Vera's tears finally came, bringing relief to the old woman's weathered face, Zara felt herself drowning in the released sorrow. Her own boundaries dissolved like salt in warm water. Mira found her afterward, sitting beside the settlement's central well with tears streaming down her face, tears that tasted like every sorrow she had ever witnessed. The caravan leader settled beside her, with the patience of someone who had navigated this particular crisis before, her silver hair catching the evening light as she spoke words that carried no judgment. Only recognition. The helper needs helping, Mira said softly. It happens to all of us, who learn to hold space for others' transformation. We become so focused on creating channels for their pain that we forget rivers need banks, and banks need tending too. Through her tears, Zara tried to explain the weight that had been building, how each act of witnessing seemed to leave residue in her bones, the growing fear that she was becoming a repository for released sorrow, rather than a clear channel through which it could flow safely toward transformation. I know how to help others let go, she whispered, but I never learned how to release what I've absorbed. Mira's eyes held depths of understanding that spoke of her own journey through this particular darkness. Tomorrow we return to where this began, she said, gesturing toward the aurora that had begun its nightly dance across the star-touched sky. Some lessons can only be learned in the place where we first discovered we had something to learn. The journey back to Naya's cottage felt like traveling upstream through memory itself. The familiar paths welcomed them with the patience of old friends, and when they crested the final hill, Zara saw the herbalist waiting in her garden as if she had been expecting them all along. Naya's eyes, soft with years of seeing beyond surfaces, held no surprise at Zara's condition, only deep understanding and the kind of love that doesn't try to fix, but simply witnesses. Even the deepest wells need cleansing, Naya murmured, as she gathered Zara into an embrace that smelled like chamomile and patient wisdom. You have been the bank for a river of feeling, little one. But even banks need to release what the water leaves behind. That evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of gentle fire, and the blood rain began to fall with renewed purpose, Naya prepared a ritual as old as Serene itself. She led Zara to the grove where luminous drops had first pooled around a sleeping child, where the planet's memory ran deepest and truest. There, beside the ancient well that had drawn water and wishes from Serene's heart for generations, she filled a copper basin with spring water, adding herbs that spoke in their quiet language. Sleep mint for gentling, dream root for remembering trust, silver leaf that grew only where the planet's memories flowed purest. This water has heard the planet's own prayers of release, Naya explained, placing the basin beneath the open sky where blood rain could fall directly into its surface, each luminous drop dissolving with a soft shimmer. It knows how to carry what is no longer yours to hold. Fen hung his newest chime in the grove's heart, one crafted from materials people had released with gratitude, its notes tuned to the pitch of Zara's breath when she slept deeply. River, who had joined them quietly, helped arrange listening cloths around the sacred space, creating a circle of witness safety. The ritual unfolded, with the natural grace of something remembered rather than invented. As Zara settled into the warm, luminous bath, the accumulated weight in her chest began to respond to the water's gentle invitation. Naya's hands moved with reverent care, pouring the blood rain-blessed water over Zara's head, while her four-note melody emerged, soft and clear, no longer muffled by absorbed sorrow. With each pour, with each gentle hum, Zara felt the accumulated echoes begin to loosen, not violently expelled but compassionately released, like morning mist remembering how to rejoin the sky. Let it flow through you. Little river, Naya whispered, her words weaving into the melody. Not into you, but through. Like the planet lets rain flow through its soil, nourishing what needs to grow. Letting the rest return to the larger currents, the feeling of saturation receded, like tide returning to sea, replaced by a profound lightness that felt like breathing truly for the first time in weeks. Her own boundaries returned, not as walls but as the gentle banks of a river, strong enough to give form, porous enough to allow flow. She was not meant to contain the world's sorrows, but to help them find their way home, to guide them back to the larger conversation between holding and releasing. When she emerged from the grove's embrace, Wrapped in Kestrel's softest cloth, the world felt newly arranged, not changed but clarified. The blood rain had gentled to the softest mist, each drop a blessing rather than a burden. Fen tied a ribbon around her wrist, woven from intention rather than obligation, its gentle weight a reminder that love, like everything else in their world, was something to be held lightly. As they walked back toward the cottage through the silver-touched evening, Zara carried with her a deeper understanding of her gift. She had learned not just how to create space for others' transformation, but how to maintain the sacred boundaries that made such work sustainable. The experience had not diminished her abilities, but deepened them, adding layers of self-compassion to her boundless empathy for others. Settling into sleep that night in the alcove near the hearth, Zara dreamed of clear water running over smooth stones, each drop carrying its burden only as far as necessary before releasing it to the next willing current. When she woke before dawn, the world hummed with renewed possibility, and somewhere in the grove, new flowers were blooming, varieties that knew how to give their fragrance freely while keeping their roots strong, teaching the ancient lesson that true service begins with tending the vessel that makes all other gifts possible. Morning brought a clean lightness that felt like breathing through newly opened windows, the kind of clarity that comes after difficult weather has passed, and the air remembers how to move freely again. Zara woke to find her four-note melody humming itself through her dreams, unencumbered and pure, carrying the gentle strength of water that knows its own course without fighting the banks that give it shape. As she shared breakfast with Naya, the familiar ritual of warm bread and herb tea felt like a homecoming to herself. The accumulated weight that had settled in her chest was gone, replaced by something more precious, the understanding that her gift was not diminished by boundaries, but made sustainable by them. She was not meant to be a reservoir for the world's sorrows, but a clear channel through which they could flow toward transformation. "You understand now," Naya said softly, watching Zara move through their morning preparations with renewed grace. "A river doesn't become the rain. It simply provides a pathway for water to find its way home." The insight settled in Zara's heart like a seed finding fertile ground, and with it came a new sense of purpose that hummed in the air around their cottage, like anticipation made audible. When Fen arrived that morning, his bottles chiming with the crystalline music of resolved sighs, he paused at the threshold with the reverence of someone approaching a friend who had returned from a difficult journey. "You sound like yourself again," he said simply, settling beside her on the cottage porch, but stronger somehow, like a tree that's weathered its first real storm and discovered its roots go deeper than it knew. Their conversation was interrupted by movement. On the path, not the urgent approach of crisis, but the steady rhythm of people with important questions to ask. River appeared first, their eyes bright with the excitement of someone who had felt significant currents shifting in the emotional weather. Behind them came a young woman, whose presence felt like morning mist, gentle and encompassing. "I'm Lyra," she said, her voice soft as falling snow. "I help restless sleepers find peace, but lately I feel as if I'm gathering all their nightmares into myself, and I don't know what to do with them." Her words carried the familiar weight of someone whose gift had begun to feel more like burden than blessing. Zara recognized the echo of her own recent struggle and felt something stir in her chest, not the overwhelming accumulation she had experienced before, but the warm expansion that came when a calling revealed its true shape. "It's not about gathering shadows," she explained gently. "It's about helping the light remember where it belongs and trusting that shadows too have their purpose in the grand turning of things." Over the following days, others arrived with similar stories. Sul, a quiet man whose presence was like a warm, unwavering flame, who could sit with people in their deepest vulnerability, but found himself drowning in their pain. Sora, a midwife whose hands brought such calm that newborns sighed when she touched their feet, but who carried home the fears of every laboring mother. Each person brought their own variation of the same essential challenge: how to help without being consumed, how to love without losing themselves. What formed around Naya's cottage was not a formal school, but an organic sharing of understanding, a patient exchange of heartfelt wisdom that grew like moss on stone, slowly, quietly, but with surprising strength. Zara taught them the fundamental principle she had learned through necessity: witness, don't absorb. Create space, don't fill it. Invite transformation, don't force it. Think of yourself as the bank of a river, she explained to Lyra as they practiced beside the cottage garden. You give shape to the flow, but you don't try to contain it. When someone's nightmares want to release, you help them find their way toward the larger currents of healing. But you don't make yourself their destination. The teaching happened through demonstration rather than lecture. Zara would wrap someone in a listening cloth and begin her 4-note melody, but now she narrated the process for her students. How she maintained her own boundaries while creating safety. How she recognized when pain was ready to transform. How she guided it toward release without pulling it into herself. Fenn discovered his role deepening within this evolving circle. His instruments, crafted from materials people had lovingly released, became teaching tools that showed how something that once held burden could be reshaped to sing songs of freedom. He taught others to listen for the music hidden in discarded objects, to hear the potential for transformation that lived in everything ready to be released. The practice spread like seeds on wind, carried by grateful hearts and whispered recommendations. Communities began requesting not urgent intervention, but gentle teaching. They wanted to learn how to tend their emotional weather before storms became overwhelming, how to create spaces where release could happen regularly rather than accumulating until crisis demanded attention. Not all attempts succeeded smoothly. In one bustling market town, a merchant tried to commercialize their methods, selling tickets to public purging sessions. The air grew thick with performative grief, nothing genuine could move, and people left feeling more burdened than before. Zara simply began washing cups at a public well, humming her melody with eyes soft and present. People gravitated toward the ordinary alchemy of warm water and witnessed quiet, away from spectacle and toward authentic connection. The secret, she explained to Sewell as they walked through the settlement afterward, is remembering that healing can't be rushed or packaged. It happens in its own time, in spaces that feel genuinely safe rather than commercially convenient. As word continued to spread through the networks of connection that linked settlements across Seren, the blood rain began falling more gently, as if the planet itself approved of this organic distribution of wisdom. New varieties of flowers bloomed in pools throughout the grove, some that opened only in starlight, others that released their fragrance when touched by tears of joy or relief. One evening, as aurora light painted the sky in shades of possibility, and their cottage filled with the warm sounds of shared meals and quiet laughter, Naya placed a gentle hand on Zara's shoulder. The elderly herbalist had grown more translucent in recent weeks, as if her edges were learning to cooperate with light, but her presence felt more luminous than ever. "This is how change truly happens," she murmured, watching the network of gentle healers that had formed around their simple home. Not through force or proclamation, but through seeds of wisdom finding fertile ground in ready hearts. You've become the teacher I always knew you would be, not by gathering students, but by helping others remember what they already knew about love. Zara nodded, feeling the truth of those words settle in her bones like honey dissolved in warm water. What had begun as her individual gift was becoming something larger, a movement toward communities that could tend their own healing, networks of gentle revolutionaries who understood that the deepest transformations happen through patience rather than pressure. Outside, the first stars appeared like promises written in light across the darkening sky, and somewhere in the patient darkness, Seren itself seemed to exhale with satisfaction. The great season of release was evolving into something sustainable, a way of being that could nurture both individual hearts and entire communities through all the seasons yet to come. As Zara settled into sleep that night, she carried with her the profound understanding that her work was no longer about being the sole channel for healing, but about helping others discover their own capacity for creating transformation. The network of Purge tenders would continue growing, each person adding their unique gifts to an ever-expanding constellation of gentle wisdom that would outlive any individual teacher and serve communities for generations to come. The translucence that had been growing in Naya's edges became more pronounced as the network of Purge tenders continued to flourish around their cottage, each new teacher carrying forward the gentle wisdom like seeds finding fertile ground in ready hearts. She moved through her daily rituals with the same patient grace she had always possessed, but now each gesture seemed to catch light differently, as if her bones were learning to cooperate with starshine and her skin was remembering its kinship. With the luminous drops that fell each evening from Seren's dreaming sky, Zara noticed the change most clearly during their morning tea ritual, when the early light would pass through Naya's hands like water through cupped fingers, creating patterns on the cottage walls that looked almost like blessings written in shadow and gold. The elderly herbalist seemed to be practicing for something. Not departure exactly, but a different kind of presence, the way flowers practice opening by first learning to trust the light that calls them toward transformation. The cottage filled. Naturally, with visitors drawn by currents they couldn't name but trusted anyway. Kestrel arrived with arms full of silver thread, settling into the rocking chair by the hearth, as if she had always belonged there. Lyra and Sul appeared at the garden gate carrying listening cloths they had woven with the patience Naya had taught them to value above speed. Fen spent quiet hours learning the final secrets of which plants needed water and which preferred solitude, his bottles sitting peacefully on the windowsills, no longer gathering sighs, but simply reflecting the aurora's nightly dance. "The planet is calling," Naya said one morning as they tended the herb garden together, her voice carrying the soft certainty of someone who had learned to recognize the difference between fear and knowing. Not urgently, but clearly, like a friend suggesting it might be time to come home after a long and beautiful visit. 3 evenings later, when the blood rain fell with unusual gentleness and the aurora painted the sky in shades that had no names, but felt like lullabies made visible, Naya asked them all to gather in the grove where Zara had first been found. They came in a small procession without calling it that, settling onto the soft moss beside the ancient well where luminous drops had once pooled around a sleeping child and changed the course of everything that followed. Naya began to speak, in the voice she had always used for the most important stories, not urgent or dramatic, but steady as breathing, patient as seasons turning. "I want to share something about the blood rain that I've been saving for when you were ready to understand its deepest truth," she said, her translucent hands catching starlight as she gestured toward the grove's luminous pools. "These drops don't carry only the planet's released sorrows, though that's part of their blessing. Each luminous drop holds the distilled essence of every act of love ever performed on Seren. Hands passing bread across a table when appetite had gone missing, a neighbor fixing a hinge so the door could close softly against wind, a child pressing a too small mitten into a friend's palm and saying it would keep them warm anyway. The revelations settled in the air around them like pollen blessing everything it touched. Zara felt the truth of it in her bones, understanding suddenly why the blood rain had always felt like more than cleansing. It was Seren's own way of remembering and redistributing love, ensuring that no act of tenderness was ever truly lost, but transformed into nourishment for whatever needed to grow. "Acts of love, stripped of everything but essence," Naya continued, her voice growing softer, but somehow more present, "gathered by the planet with the care of a patient archivist, and returned to the world when it most needs to remember what it's made of. Every release makes space not just for healing, but for love to find new forms." As she spoke, the blood rain seemed to respond to her words, falling in patterns that caught the grove's luminescence and reflected it back in spirals of light that danced around them like visible music. The accumulated wisdom of her years began to settle in the air like a benediction, blessing everything it touched with the patient understanding she had spent a lifetime cultivating. When the moment came, it arrived like the gentlest of breezes, not sudden or violent, but natural as breathing. Naya simply closed her eyes and exhaled, and as she did, her translucence became complete. She didn't disappear but transformed, becoming part of the grove's own luminescence, her presence settling into the soil and the starlight, and the patient wisdom that lived in every listening cloth and healing herb. Zara felt the moment not as loss, but as completion, the way a song feels complete when its final note dissolves into silence. Tears came, but they were tears that tasted like gratitude rather than grief, carrying the salt of recognition rather than the bitterness of abandonment. Around the circle, each person processed the transformation in their own way, Fen hanging a chime crafted from Naya's favorite herb basket, its notes singing quiet remembrance. River placing a palm against the earth and whispering thanks. Lyra folding a listening cloth with ceremonial care. In the days that followed, they discovered that Naya's presence hadn't departed, but had simply changed form. The way water becomes mist, becomes rain, becomes nourishment for whatever needs to grow. The cottage felt blessed by her continued presence, its rooms holding the warmth of someone who had learned to love so completely that love itself had become her legacy. Standing in the grove one evening, as the aurora began its nightly dance, Zara placed her hand on the ancient well and felt the deep currents of connection that linked all hearts learning to love through letting go. Naya's final teaching had been the most profound of all. That love, when practiced with enough patience and grace, becomes something that can never be lost, only transformed into new forms of blessing that continue nurturing the world long after. The original teacher has dissolved into light. The seedy grove where Naya had transformed into luminescence began to hum, with a different quality of anticipation in the weeks that followed, as if the very earth was preparing to hold something larger than memory. Visitors arrived not with urgency, but with the patient recognition of people following currents they trusted without needing to name, settling beside the ancient well where blood rain pooled like liquid starlight and whispering wishes that seemed to dissolve directly into Seren's dreaming heart. It was during one of these quiet gatherings that the idea began to take visible form. Fen sat beside the largest pool, his fingers working with fragments of glass that had been released during the Great Purging, pieces that caught aurora light and held it like crystallized hope. "This place wants to hold more," he said softly, his words carrying the weight of recognition rather than suggestion. Not just occasional visitors, but a permanent space where the planet's own teaching can continue. The response came not as formal planning, but as organic flowering. River walked the grove with bare feet, eyes half closed, mapping emotional currents the way morning mist follows the contours of sleeping valleys. They showed Zara where people naturally paused, which clearings drew breath deeper, where the blood rain gathered with particular luminescence. "Here," River murmured, placing a palm against earth that seemed to pulse with patient readiness. "The ground remembers every footstep, every tear, every moment of release. It's ready to hold something permanent." Word traveled through the networks of connection that linked settlements across Seren, not as urgent news, but as gentle invitation, carried by people who had experienced transformation in the grove and understood that some gifts were meant to be shared rather than hoarded. A delegation from the coastal settlements arrived, carrying materials shaped by patient tides, driftwood worn smooth by decades of waves, shells that sang when touched by wind, stones that held the memory of every storm they had weathered. Mountain folk brought timber blessed by altitude and time, their wood singing with the patience of trees that had learned to bend without breaking. Desert dwellers contributed sand that remembered stars, while valley settlements offered clay that held every season's rain in its molecular memory. Each offering came wrapped not in obligation, but in gratitude, materials released with love and ready to serve love's larger purposes. The building grew like moss on stone, slowly, quietly, but with surprising strength. Kestrel arrived with arms full of listening cloths, weaving them into a canopy that breathed with its own gentle rhythm, creating shelter that felt more like embrace than enclosure. Soil crafted benches from the released timber, shaping them to invite reclining rather than rigid posture, understanding that the body's willingness to soften often led the heart toward trust. Fen discovered his role as architect of transformation, working with materials that had been lovingly released to create instruments of ongoing healing. He crafted wind chimes from old jewelry, their notes tuned to harmonize with Zara's four-note melody. He shaped bowls from the coastal offerings, vessels that could hold blood rain and reflect starlight with equal reverence. Each element was placed not according to rigid design, but in response to the grove's own guidance, creating spaces that felt grown rather than constructed. When they named it the Sanctuary of Soft Sounds, the title emerged naturally from the way evening breezes found Fen's chimes and coaxed from them music that spoke of transformation without trauma, of release without violence. The name settled into the grove like morning dew, belonging so completely that no one could imagine calling it anything else. The first formal gathering happened without ceremony, the way most sacred things begin, quietly, naturally, with people arriving as evening painted the sky in shades of gentle fire. They brought their own listening cloths and simple offerings, sandwiches wrapped in herb-scented fabric, fruit that tasted like captured sunlight, tea that steamed with intention rather than mere warmth. Zara moved through the sanctuary like a gentle current, her four-note melody rising and falling with the breathing of the gathered community. The sound that filled the space was like conversation between old friends, unhurried, accepting, full of comfortable silences that spoke more eloquently than words. People settled onto Sol's carefully crafted benches, wrapped themselves in Kestrel's listening cloths, and began the patient work of witnessing their own readiness to transform. A young woman arrived carrying a wooden bird, intricately carved and worn smooth by years of handling. Her grandmother had pressed it into her palm with dying breath, along with the expectation that she would continue the family's storytelling tradition. The bird, once comfort, had become burden, a symbol of inherited duty that felt too heavy for her uncertain hands. As she spoke, her voice trembling with the weight of unfulfilled expectations, Zara wrapped her in the softest listening cloth and began to hum. Then hung a delicate chime nearby, one crafted from a discarded quill, and its notes blended with Zara's melody like voices finding harmony. The blood rain fell softly into the sanctuary's central basin, each luminous drop creating ripples that caught candlelight and reflected it back as liquid blessing. Gradually, the young woman's shoulders relaxed, and she began to speak not of failure but of her grandmother's love, of the stories she did want to tell in her own unique voice. When she finally placed the wooden bird in the luminous water, it didn't sink but floated, catching light as if remembering its own inner brilliance. She understood then that honoring her grandmother didn't require becoming her grandmother, that love could be inherited without obligation, treasured without imprisonment. As the evening deepened and participants shared simple meals from baskets they had brought, the sanctuary settled into rhythms that felt ancient, despite their newness. Children played games that involved no winning or losing, only the joy of movement and connection. Adults discovered that conversation flowed more easily here, as if the space itself invited authenticity over performance. When the gathering drew to its natural close, people departed carrying something lighter than what they had brought, not because burdens had been taken from them, but because they had learned to compost weight into wisdom, grief into gratitude. The sanctuary's pools reflected the first stars like promises written in light across the patient darkness, and somewhere in the grove, new varieties of flowers began to bloom, species that knew how to give their fragrance freely while keeping their roots strong. Walking back to the cottage through the silver-touched evening, Zara carried with her the profound satisfaction of seeing seeds planted in love take root in fertile hearts. The sanctuary of soft sounds had found its rhythm in a single evening, but she understood that its true work would unfold over seasons and years, creating space where communities could practice the gentle art of transformation that Seren itself had been teaching through the patient revolution of its blood rain. Settling into sleep in rooms that still held Naya's luminous presence, Zara dreamed of clear water running over smooth stones, each drop carrying its burden only as far as necessary before releasing it to the next willing current. The sanctuary breathed quietly in the grove, its listening cloth stirring with evening breezes that carried the scent of chamomile and the distant music of chimes singing gratitude to the star-drunk sky. The sanctuary of soft sounds had found its breathing in the months, since its first gathering, settling into rhythms that felt as natural as the aurora's nightly dance across Seren's patient sky. The grove hummed with quiet purpose, its listening cloth stirring in evening breezes that carried the scent of chamomile and the distant music of chimes singing gratitude to the stars. What had begun as occasional visits had evolved into something deeper, a living school where the art of gentle transformation was passed from heart to heart like seeds finding fertile ground. River arrived at dawn with eyes bright as morning stars, their connection to Seren's emotional currents having deepened into something approaching fluency. They could read the planet's moods the way others might read weather patterns, sensing not just individual readiness, but the larger tides of collective transformation that moved through communities like invisible rivers. "The teaching season is beginning," they said softly, settling beside the luminous pools where blood rain had gathered into mirrors that reflected possibility itself. I can feel them coming. People who are ready not just to be helped, but to learn how to help. The first students arrived not as empty vessels seeking to be filled, but as individuals who had already begun their own work with release and recognized they were ready for deeper understanding. Among them was Sage, a young person whose presence felt like dawn mist. Gentle, encompassing, able to sense when entire communities held patterns older than anyone living. Whole settlements sometimes carry grief that's been inherited like family recipes, Sage explained, but much less nourishing. Zara discovered that teaching felt more like gardening than instruction, patient cultivation of understanding that grew in its own time, tended with gentle attention rather than forced through rigid curriculum. She found herself sharing 3 fundamental types of listening that had become the foundation of all their work. First, listening to themselves, maintaining the clear boundaries that allowed them to witness without absorbing. Second, listening to the person before them, hearing not just words but the spaces between words where truth often lived. And finally, listening to Seren itself, whose planetary breath could be felt by anyone willing to wait without demanding. Your presence is the most powerful tool, she would say, as they practiced beside the sanctuary's central basin, watching blood rain dissolve into luminous water like liquid blessings, to truly see another's readiness, to hear their unspoken longing for release, and to offer them the safe space to remember their own capacity for transformation. That is the heart of our work. The practical lessons unfolded through gentle demonstration rather than lecture. When a young woman named Echo arrived carrying her grandmother's unfinished tapestry, a burden of inherited expectations, that felt too heavy for her uncertain hands, Zara guided her students through the delicate process of witnessing without intervening. They watched as Echo's shoulders gradually relaxed under a listening cloth, as her 4-note melody helped the young woman distinguish between honoring her grandmother's love and imprisoning herself in another's dreams. Fen had evolved into a master teacher of transformation, showing students how to craft instruments from materials people had lovingly released. His workshop beneath the willow became a place where old jewelry learned to sing as wind chimes, where broken pottery found new voice as drums that beat with the rhythm of resolved sorrow. This metal remembers being a hinge, he would say, holding up fragments of an old door latch. Help it remember how to open rather than close. Not every lesson proceeded smoothly, and these moments became the most valuable teachings of all. When a student named June tried to help a visitor release anger, and instead caught the sparks in his own chest, like a sleeve brushing a candle, Zara was beside him before words were necessary. Together they demonstrated the crucial practice of letting absorbed emotions flow through rather than settling in, using the sanctuary's luminous water and steady breathing to guide the heat safely toward transformation. As the network of purge tenders continued to expand across Seren's inhabited regions, River began to sense something unprecedented building in the planet's deeper currents. Pressure shifting across the northern grasslands, they would report during evening gatherings, their voice carrying the wonder of someone witnessing weather patterns that had never existed before. Not urgency, but invitation. Something larger than individual healing is stirring. The blood rain itself seemed to respond to their collective work, falling more gently now, less like a profound planetary exhalation and more like regular cleansing breath. The seasons flowed with newfound grace, and the impossible flowers that bloomed in the grove's pools carried colors that spoke of Seren, learning to trust its own capacity for ongoing transformation rather than crisis-driven release. One evening, as aurora light painted the sky in shades of possibility, and the sanctuary filled with the warm sounds of shared meals and quiet laughter, Zara watched River guide a circle of new students through meditation beside the luminous pools. River's voice, clear and steady, spoke of the planet's deep breath, of the interconnectedness of all letting go, of the quiet bravery required to trust transformation. Hearing her own teachings reflected back through, River's unique understanding filled Zara with profound satisfaction. She realized that her work had evolved beyond individual healing into something more precious, the cultivation of a living lineage that would continue growing long after any single teacher had dissolved into light. Each student brought their own gifts to the collective wisdom, Lyra's ability to weave dreams into patterns of peace, Saul's mastery of healing presence, Echo's talent for helping people distinguish between inherited duty and chosen love. As evening deepened and the first stars appeared like promises written across the patient darkness, River approached with the quiet reverence that preceded important observations. "The current is building towards something unprecedented," they said softly. "Communities are beginning to ask not just for healing, but for help with patterns that have shaped entire regions for generations. The planet is ready to teach us about transformation on a scale we've never attempted." Settling into sleep that night in rooms that still held Naya's luminous presence, Zara carried with her the profound understanding that her work was entering its next evolution. The sanctuary breathed quietly around them, its chimes singing gentle gratitude to the star-drunk sky. While somewhere in the patient darkness, Seren itself seemed to exhale with satisfaction, feeling the gentle revolution of hearts learning to teach other hearts the ancient art of letting go with love. The network of Purge tenders had become something beautiful and unprecedented, not a hierarchy of knowledge, but a living web of wisdom that grew stronger. With each new connection, each student who became a teacher, each community that learned to tend its own emotional weather, with the same patient care they gave their gardens and their children. The unprecedented current that River had been tracking through Seren's deeper layers began to manifest in ways that made even the most experienced Purge tenders pause with quiet wonder. What had started as subtle shifts in the blood rain's patterns, falling in spirals that seemed to mirror the sanctuary's own breathing, pooling in formations that spoke of planetary intention rather than random weather, evolved over the following seasons into something that transformed the very fabric of how communities held and released their collective patterns. The first request for large-scale transformation came from the northern grasslands, where 5 settlements had maintained careful distances from each other since resource disputes that predated anyone's living memory. River spent days walking the boundaries between communities with bare feet, eyes half closed, mapping emotional currents that moved like invisible rivers beneath the surface of ordinary awareness. "The patterns run deeper than individual grief," they reported, their voice carrying the awe of someone witnessing weather systems that existed beyond previous understanding. "Entire regions are holding breath they inherited from their grandparents, and the planet is ready to help them exhale when Zara, Fen, and their growing circle of teachers arrived in the grasslands. They found themselves preparing for work on a scale that dwarfed anything they had previously attempted. Instead of single circles, they created constellations of healing spaces, listening cloths arranged in overlapping spirals across hills and valleys, connected by pathways wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side in companionable silence. Fen and his students hung chimes between the low acacia trees, tuning them carefully to harmonize with Zara's 4-note melody, so that a sound begun in one place could find its answer miles away. The gathering itself unfolded without ceremony, the way most sacred things begin, quietly, naturally, with people arriving as evening painted the sky in shades of gentle fire. Representatives from all 5 communities came carrying not weapons or formal treaties, but simple offerings wrapped in herb-scented cloth, bread that tasted like captured sunlight, early fruit that held the sweetness of patient seasons, tea that steamed with intention rather than mere warmth. What made this transformation different from individual healing was the way old patterns had roots that went deeper than memory, threading through generations like mycelium connecting distant trees. The original resource disputes had grown from fear rather than scarcity, protective boundaries that had outlived their usefulness but continued operating from habit rather than necessity. Children from different settlements played together naturally when adults weren't watching, their laughter carrying no anxiety about invisible lines that had been drawn across the landscape decades before their birth. When the moment of collective release began, it moved through the grasslands like gentle weather. Zara's melody rose not as performance but as invitation, creating space where centuries of careful separation could remember their readiness to transform. The sound rode the evening wind like a patient rider teaching a skittish horse how to turn, soothing the air with familiarity rather than force. In one spiral, elders laid out rusted tools that had once enforced boundaries, ready to let measurement give way to mercy. In another, a young woman set down ledger books inherited from 3 generations, their pages filled with numbers that had governed her community through scarcity and fear. The breakthrough came not through dramatic revelation, but through the accumulation of small recognitions, like morning mist gradually lifting to reveal a landscape that had always been whole. As Zara's 4-note melody traveled into distances she could not see, multiply without losing itself, it returned to her on a note that was not hers at all, Serene's own low hum, the lullaby the planet must have been singing to itself since the beginning, patient and unafraid. When the deep swell gathered, the region chose to breathe as one. The wind changed its mind about worry and decided to cradle instead. The grass became a choir that sang of transformation without trauma, of release without violence. Fen's instruments caught echoes of each community's exhale, weaving them into music that spoke of completion rather than ending, while the blood rain that fell carried colors none of them had seen before, shades that spoke of planetary satisfaction, of serene, itself learning new ways to breathe through the hearts of those who called it home. The work required a different kind of patience than individual healing, but the results rippled outward in ways that transformed not just the participating communities, but the very emotional climate of entire regions. Word traveled through the networks of connection that linked settlements across Seren, not as urgent news but as gentle invitation. Mountain communities began requesting similar guidance to release inherited feuds. Desert settlements prepared to share resources that had been hoarded from ancient anxiety. Valley towns grew willing to dissolve barriers that had been maintained more from habit than necessity. As seasons turned and the great work continued, Seren's climate itself seemed to respond to the widespread practice of letting go. The blood rain fell more regularly now, less like crisis intervention and more like the planet's natural breathing made visible. Aurora displays grew more frequent, painting the sky in patterns that seemed to celebrate the ongoing revolution of hearts, learning to hold their treasures lightly, love without clinging, and trust that what was meant to stay would remain while what was ready to go would transform into something even more beautiful than memory. Standing in the sanctuary one evening, as the first stars appeared like promises written across the patient darkness, Zara felt the profound satisfaction of witnessing transformation on a scale that dwarfed her original understanding. The network of Purge tenders had become something unprecedented. Not just healers, but midwives to an entirely new way of being, helping communities birth themselves into patterns of connection that honored both individual autonomy and collective flourishing. River approached with the quiet reverence that preceded their most important observations. "The planetary current has shifted," they said softly, their eyes reflecting depths that seemed to hold not just years but cycles. Communities are no longer asking for help with crisis. They're asking to learn the art of ongoing transformation. Serene is teaching us that healing happens in spirals, each cycle of letting go making space for greater capacity to hold joy, love, and wonder. As evening deepened and the aurora began its nightly dance across the star-touched sky, Zara felt something she had been sensing for weeks finally crystallize into recognition. The work was approaching its next great turning, not an ending but a transformation as profound as any they had witnessed. Somewhere in the grove where she had first been found, new varieties of flowers bloomed in patterns that spoke of planetary contentment, their petals holding traces of the same luminescence that lived beneath her skin, as if the world itself was preparing for one final gentle revolution that would complete the great circle of learning they had all been traveling together. The night air smelled of chamomile, of rain thinking about falling, of a lullaby already on its way home. The morning when transformation finally called to Zara arrived like a gentle exhale, the aurora lingering past dawn, as if the sky itself wanted to witness what was about to unfold. She woke with silver traces moving beneath her skin, like constellations learning to navigate by feeling rather than sight, her 4-note melody deepening into harmonies that seemed to encompass every heart she had ever helped find its way home. In the cottage garden, where she had learned to tend herbs with Naya's patient wisdom, Zara felt the familiar tug of recognition that came when something true aligned with something she had always known but never named. The network of Purge tenders. had grown beyond anything she could have imagined. Communities across Seren now tended their own emotional weather with gentle care, creating spaces where transformation could happen regularly rather than accumulating until crisis demanded attention. Fen approached through the morning mist, his collection of instruments singing softly with each step, but when he looked at her, his eyes held depths of understanding that spoke not of surprise, but of quiet preparation. "You're becoming part of the rain itself," he said simply, settling beside her on Sol's carefully crafted bench. His words carried no sadness, only the profound recognition of someone witnessing the natural completion of a cycle that had been building since they first met beneath the birch tree, where sighs learned to sing. River appeared at the garden gate, with eyes that reflected the lingering aurora, their connection to Seren's deeper currents having evolved into something approaching unity. "The planetary exhale is complete," they said softly. "The great season of learning to let go has taught the world how to breathe differently. Now Seren is ready to integrate all we've learned into its own rhythm." As the day unfolded, visitors arrived not with urgency, but with the patient recognition of people following currents they trusted without needing to name. The sanctuary filled with familiar faces, Lyra carrying listening cloths woven from intention, Sage bringing new students who had learned to sense inherited patterns, Echo holding work that spoke of love transformed into chosen purpose. They gathered not to witness departure, but to celebrate the beautiful alchemy of becoming. When evening approached and the blood rain began its gentle fall, Zara felt her edges beginning to cooperate with light, the way Naya's had in her final days. But this wasn't ending. It was expansion, the natural evolution of someone who had learned to love so completely that love itself had become her legacy. She could feel herself beginning to merge with the planet's own purging cycles, her consciousness widening to encompass the gentle wisdom of letting go that she had spent her lifetime learning. Walking through the sanctuary one final time, Zara placed her hands on each listening cloth, each chime, each bowl that held luminous water. Everywhere she touched, the space responded with subtle recognition, not dramatic, just the gentle loosening that meant the world was saying goodbye to a friend. Fen tied Thessa's ribbon to his newest chime, crafted from the first materials ever released in the sanctuary, its notes tuned to the pitch of her breath when she slept deeply. As the transformation began, Zara wrapped herself in Kestrel's softest cloth and settled beside the central basin, where blood rain dissolved into luminous mirrors. She breathed her four-note melody into her own ribs, not to signal anyone else's release, but to welcome her own. The notes met Serene's low hum and braided together, a lullaby remembering it was part of a larger song. What came next felt not like dissolution, but like spaciousness. Her boundaries became like riverbanks at flood time, still present, but willing to trust the wider water. When the first drops of blood rain touched her forehead, they felt like the world placing a cool hand on fevered brow. She didn't vanish, she distributed. Her presence settled into the listening cloths, into the benches that encouraged rest, into the bowls that caught starlight and made it drinkable. Fen sat with his back against the willow and let the tears come, the gentle kind that washed rather than wore. "I'll listen for you in the wind," he whispered, and the wind answered by moving through the chime like a hand through sleeping hair. Here it sounded like yes. In the weeks that followed, the sanctuary didn't become a monument but remained a living room the planet had made for itself. Students listened for Zara's four notes and found them everywhere, in the hush between sentences, in the pause before apology, in the first breath after someone decided to forgive themselves. The blood rain continued its softer rhythm, arriving as regular kindness, the way dawn needed no announcement. Her story became part of the lullaby that Seren sang to itself, a reminder that love sometimes means letting go, and that what we release with gratitude always returns transformed. The network of Purge tenders continued their gentle work, each teacher carrying forward the understanding that healing happens in spirals, each cycle making space for greater capacity to hold joy, love and wonder. And with that, like the planet's own gentle exhale, our story finds its way to rest. And somewhere in the space between sleeping and waking, it continues to whisper its quiet truths to anyone ready to listen. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay.